Chapter 1. The Garden Fete and the Man Who Forgot His Tea. It was a Saturday of perfect ordinariness in the village of Darnley, the kind of soft English afternoon that seemed tailor-made for lemonade, mild gossip, and lawn chairs that creaked. Under the weight of age and memory, St. Petronella's annual garden fete was in full swing, a cheerful smattering of stalls and bunting fluttering across the vicarage lawns. There was a brass band struggling valiantly with Elgar, a sponge cake competition judged by the rather vain Mrs. Ethel Price, and a tombola that had already awarded 3 tins of pears in syrup and 1 slightly cracked teapot dot, Miss Jane Marple, dressed in dove gray and perched like a quiet sparrow near the tea-tat, watched it all with eyes that missed nothing. Her knitting rested in her lap 3 neat rows of stocking stitch, abandoned without a second thought the moment she'd noticed Mrs. Lydia Hargreaves serve Mr. Colin Vole a second cup of tea with a smile that was 2 degrees too warm. "It's lovely, isn't it?" beamed young Ellie Townsend, plopping herself beside Miss Marple with a plate of scones. "The village does feel so alive on fete days." "Yes, dear," Miss Marple said mildly, "though I find such gatherings often stir things that might have been better left undisturbed." Ellie blinked. "You mean old rivalries?" Miss Marple gave a faint, unreadable smile. "Sometimes, and sometimes things older still." From the far end of the lawn came a shriek. High and thin, the sound stilled the clink of teacups, and hushed even the band's valiant second trombone. The crowd parted like fabric ripped down the seam. A small group was gathered near the side of the church hall, around something or someone slumped awkwardly against the low brick-walled dot. It was Mr. Colin Vole. His teacup lay shattered at his side. His eyes were open, but held the dull stare of one who would never sip another cup again. Miss Marple stood. She did not hurry, nor did she linger. Like a well-written sentence, she moved with quiet purpose, her shawl trailing slightly as she approached the gathering storm of voices. "Oh, Lord," muttered Reverend Baines, pale beneath his straw hat. "Someone get Dr. Radnor." "Was it the heat?" Mrs. Price asked no one in particular, dabbing her forehead. "He just dropped," said Lydia Hargreaves faintly, her hands trembling around a lace handkerchief. "He was perfectly fine just now. I poured him tea not 10 minutes ago," Miss Marple observed. She saw how Mr. Vole's collar was slightly askew. She noted the faint trace of pink around his lips. She noticed, too, that no one, not one of the villagers, dared to touch the cup dot. It was the sort of death that might easily pass as natural to the untrained eye. A man of 57, recently returned to Darnley after years abroad, dropping dead at a public gathering most would chalk it up to a weak heart, poor diet, the usual grim gifts of middle age. But Miss Marple knew too much about villagers and their secrets, and she knew that Colin Vole had not merely fainted. She knew because he had told her something peculiar just an hour before, during a brief conversation over lavender biscuits. "Funny, Miss Marple," he had said. "I've returned home, and yet I feel more of a stranger now than I ever did in Madrid or Tangier. There's a sort of uneasiness, as if Darnley is smiling, but with its teeth showing. And now here he was dashed dead. Dr. Radnor arrived huffing and sweating and pronounced Colin Vole deceased. Cardiac event, likely. Could have been his age, or the heat, or both. The crowd began to disperse, but the air had changed. Beneath the bunting and the teacups, something colder crept in, like the first shiver of autumn in a summer breeze. Miss Marple lingered by the tea tent. She quietly asked Ellie, "Did you happen to see which teapot was used for Mr. Vole's cup?" Ellie blinked. Why, there were two. One for Earl Grey, the other for Darjeeling. "And did you notice which Mrs. Hargraves poured from?" "I think Darjeeling. Why?" Miss Marple looked at the twin pots. One was nearly full. The other was almost empty. A smile touched her lips, faint and unreadable. "Well," she said softly, "I dare say someone has already forgotten which cup they poured, but I haven't." And with that, Miss Marple returned to her chair and her knitting. She did not resume her stitching. Not yet. There was something unfolding. Something that would need quiet watching, because Colin Vole's death, she suspected, was not an accident. It was a message, and someone, perhaps someone in the village who had smiled at her not 10 minutes earlier, had just delivered it. Chapter 2. A village full of theories by the following morning. The bunting had been taken down, the sponge cakes packed away or politely discarded, and Darnley had returned to the curious quiet that always follows a local uproar. But this time something lingered, a dull hum of speculation, sharpening behind drawn curtains and over breakfast tables. The death of Colin Vole was not the kind of thing that could be simply folded away like the Fates tablecloths. At the Blue Hen Bakery, Mrs. Myrtle Biddle, a woman built like a teapot and twice as brisk, whispered to her sister behind the counter, unaware, or perhaps entirely aware, that two customers lingered nearby, pretending to admire rye loaves. "I don't care what Dr. Radnor says," Myrtle sniffed, slicing a carrot bun with unnecessary force. "Colin Vole didn't die of no heat. There's something off in it. Did you see Lydia Hargreaves' face when he dropped? White as a church candle." "Lydia's always pale," her sister replied, but softly, because gossip in Darnley was currency, and even facts had to be tendered with care. The two customers, a school teacher, and the postmistress, nodded quietly to one another. Up the lane at the vicarage, Reverend Baines paced before the parlor window, sipping his morning tea with an air of fidgeting concern. His wife, Millicent, sat primly on the sofa with her knitting, clicking her needles as if the rhythm might fend off disorder. "It's not right," the vicar muttered. "He was only back a fortnight, keeps to himself mostly, but polite." Sighed. "Something about wanting peace. Now he's dead under our bell tower." Millicent sniffed. "Well, it wasn't your tea tent, darling." He looked at her. "What do you mean?" But Millicent merely resumed her purling, the corners of her mouth pressed tight. In the small, ivy-choked cottage on Church Lane, Miss Marple sat quietly. By the window, a thin stream of morning light brushing over her floral teacup. She stirred her tea absent-mindedly, eyes drifting to the page of the newspaper before her. But the print did not interest her. What mattered was the silence of the morning. Darnley was not silent by nature. It was a village that breathed in chatter and exhaled conclusions, no matter how ill-supported. She had already received 2 visitors before noon. Ellie Townsend, with a fresh pot of jam and an anxious heart, and Mr. Tom Baker, the churchwarden, under the pretense of returning a book Miss Marple had not lent him. "You think they'll have an inquest?" he asked, adjusting his cap for the 3rd time. "Only," It's unusual, isn't it? Him just dropping dead like that. And on fete day, Miss Marple smiled gently. The village does so love an occasion. He blinked, unsure if that was agreement. It's Lydia I feel for, he added. Being the last to speak with him and all, Miss Marple did not reply immediately. Her attention had fixed on something smaller than the concern in Tom's voice, a fleck of dark tea leaves clinging to the rim of her cup, barely visible unless one looked closely. Like most things in life, well, she said at last, sometimes one sees more clearly when one is not trying to. He looked puzzled, as most people did when Miss Marple offered something halfway, between wisdom and misdirection. She asked after his rheumatism, which he seemed both surprised and pleased, she remembered, and soon he was gone. It was shortly after that Inspector Grayson arrived from Market Ledbury. He was a neat man, all iron sleeves and a mustache that refused to droop. His manner was polite, but his eyes were alert in a way Miss Marple approved of. The inspector visited Lydia Hargreaves first. The widow lived in the modest cottage behind the alehouse that had once belonged to her husband, Arthur, long deceased, though still often referenced in village conversation as poor Artie with his liver. Miss Marple, passing by at what she later described as an entirely coincidental hour, caught sight of the inspector through the open window. Lydia was sitting, hands clenched on her lap, her cup of tea untouched on the table. Miss Marple noted the fraying sleeve on her cardigan and the scuff on her shoe. Neither were things Lydia Hargreaves would usually allow. That, to Miss Marple, said rather a lot. When the inspector emerged, Miss Marple offered a courteous greeting. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, adjusting his hat. "I believe you were present when when the incident occurred." "I was," she said simply, "though I fear I was more occupied with my knitting than with any proper observation." He smiled, but his eyes narrowed. "I understand." Mr. Vole was something of a newcomer. "Not entirely," she said. "He was raised here, you know, left in his 20s. Spain, then Morocco, and I believe a brief stint in Argentina, if gossip can be trusted." And why had he returned? Peace. "I think," she said softly, "he inherited his aunt's cottage when she passed last spring. Most thought he'd sell it, but he didn't." The inspector jotted something down. "Did he have any connections here? Friends? Enemies?" Miss Marple paused. "Darnley is very good at remembering sins, Inspector. Though not always accurately, Mr. Vole may have come seeking peace. But I'm afraid the village keeps sharper records than any bank." The inspector nodded, not quite sure what to make of that. Miss Marple, for her part, had. Except perhaps Miss Marple. Hugh Penbury looked up. "You're all forgetting something important. Colin Vole had enemies elsewhere. Spain, for instance, Argentina. We have no idea what kind of business he was involved in abroad." "But how would they get to him here?" asked Greta. "It's not exactly a hub of international intrigue, is it?" The pub door opened just then, and everyone turned as a figure stepped inside Grace Hargreaves, Lydia's sister-in-law. She was rarely seen in public, preferring the company of her cat and a growing library of medical thrillers. Her appearance in the Arms was enough to turn heads. She marched to the bar, ordered a sherry, and turned to face the room. "You all ought to be ashamed," she said coldly. "Lydia didn't kill anyone. You've no idea what she's lived with. There, was a silence. Arthur wasn't just a drunk, Grace continued. He was cruel. And when Colin left, she lost the only friend who ever listened to her. You want a suspect? Look in the mirror, each one of you. You let her stay in that marriage. You called it private business. With that, she took her sherry and left Miss Marple, who had quietly entered a moment before and taken a seat in the far corner with a cup of tea, looked not at Grace's retreating figure, but at the faces left behind. Some bore guilt, others confusion, but none, curiously, showed surprise. Later, Inspector Grayson stood in the widow's alehouse for the first time. The place smelled of mildew and old wood, the air heavy with disuse. He made his way to the basement steps with a torch, his boots creaking with each tread. The basement was dry, to his surprise. Clean, almost. And in the far corner stood something unexpected. A wooden crate, nailed shut, and recently disturbed. Inside. He found documents. Papers bearing the seal of the Spanish consulate. Letters in half-translated legal jargon, and a birth certificate British issued in Darnley the name on it. Thomas Arthur Hargreaves. Grayson exhaled slowly. It wasn't Lydia's name that struck him. It was the father's name listed beside it. Colin. Vole. When he emerged from the basement and stepped back into the gray light of evening. He wasn't sure what he believed anymore, but he knew Miss Marple would already be several steps ahead. Chapter 5. A hidden clue the next morning brought with it a brittle wind, one that rattled windows and scraped dead leaves along cobblestone lanes. Darnley seemed less like a village and more like a stage now, its every curtain twitch and careful conversation part of a script only half understood. And Miss Marple, knitting untouched in her lap, listened for the pauses rather than the lines themselves. She had not yet learned of the birth certificate, though she suspected something of equal weight had emerged. The look on Inspector Grayson's face when he passed her, on his way from the widow's alehouse the previous evening, had been tightly stitched, but the eyes had given him away. They had the weary gleam of someone who had glimpsed a thread in the tapestry and was not yet sure whether to tug. That morning, Miss Marple made a seemingly mundane decision. She paid a visit to young Ellie Townsend. The Townsend cottage was modest and well kept, with a small rose garden out front and a smell of lavender polish that lingered in the hallway. Ellie herself greeted Miss Marple in her apron, flustered and holding a wooden spoon still dusted with flour. "Oh, do come in, Miss Marple. I was just trying to bake a seed cake, though I fear I've overdone the zest." "I'm sure it will be lovely, dear." "I won't stay long," Miss Marple said, stepping inside. "Just a small question. I was remembering the fete, and I thought of something I hadn't asked you." Ellie blinked. "Yes? When you brought Mr. Vole his tea, or rather, when you saw Lydia do so, did you notice anything unusual?" Ellie thought, frowning slightly. Only that she looked very calm. Too calm, perhaps. I assumed it was shock afterward, but now she bit her lip. "Oh, but I did think it odd. Come to think of it, Mr. Vole dropped his napkin before drinking, just as Lydia handed him the cup." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Did he pick it up?" "No, I did," Ellie said. "I was standing nearby. I bent down, gave it back to him. Then he took the tea. And the cup? Did Lydia hold it the whole time?" "I think so." "Oh, but wait while I was bent down, she placed it briefly on the table, just for a moment. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened, not with alarm, but with quiet interest. "Thank you, dear. That's most helpful." She left Ellie to her cake and thoughts and proceeded directly to the vicarage, where Reverend Baines was fussing over the flower-beds. "Miss Marple," he said with a smile that barely concealed his worry, "have you come to water the roses with suspicion?" "I never water anything unless I expect it to grow," she replied sweetly. "I wondered, Reverend, about Mr. Vole's return. You said he came back quietly, but was it truly without fanfare? He must have reached out to someone." The vicar scratched behind his ear. "Now that you mention it, there was something peculiar. A week before the fete, he asked if I still kept records of marriage banns and birth registrations. I told him the older ones are archived, of course. He seemed nervous. Asked if I thought old records could be used against someone." "And you said?" "I said what any man of the cloth would. The past belongs to God, and perhaps the archives." He looked uneasy. But it struck me he wasn't asking idly. He was afraid. Miss Marple nodded. "It's strange, isn't it? How the sins of the past have a way of crawling into the light, no matter how neatly one tries to bury them." She returned to her cottage by midday, but not before stopping at the gate of the old schoolhouse, where Greta Sims was pinning up a notice for a sewing circle. "Terrible business about Mr. Vole," Greta said at once. "Lydia must be beside herself, though she never did like to show it." Said Miss Marple. "Tell me, Greta, did you know Lydia well when she was younger?" "Before she married Arthur, yes. We all did. She was quite lovely then. Quiet, clever. Colin was always about used to wait for her outside choir practice, rain or shine. Then he vanished. Her father insisted she marry Arthur." "Did she love Arthur?" Greta gave a short laugh. "Lydia didn't love anyone after that." Miss Marple turned that over in her mind as she returned home. She lit a small fire in the grate and sat with her notebook not to write, but to map. On the page she drew no names, only roles: the man who left, the widow, the child who was never spoken of, the sister who saw too much, the teacup set down. That last detail now occupied her thoughts. If the cup had been placed on the table unguarded, even for a moment, then the possibility widened. Lydia might have poured the tea, but anyone nearby could have tampered with it. And yet Miss Marple did not think the murder had been committed in haste. No. The key to understanding lay not in the act, but in its purpose. Later that afternoon, a gentle knock brought Inspector Grayson to her door. He entered with a sigh, removing his hat and glancing around the cottage as if hoping it might offer him more answers than the alehouse had. "I thought you might like to see this," he said, holding out a folded paper. She took it, read it, and gave a soft breath. "I see. I found it in a crate in the alehouse basement. Legal documents, Spanish, and this British. The birth certificate. Thomas Arthur Hargreaves," she read. "Father, Colin Vole. Mother, Lydia Hargreaves." Grayson nodded. Born in 1946, 2 years before Arthur's death. No mention of the child in any record since. No school, no christening. "Hidden," Miss Marple said softly. "Exactly. But why?" She handed it back. "Because a man like Arthur Hargreaves would not have taken kindly to being made a fool. and because Lydia knew what safety cost. Grayson was silent. "It's not enough to know who had reason," Miss Marple said gently. "We must understand who had knowledge, and how that knowledge returned to haunt them." He stood. "You still believe the answer lies in the village?" "I believe the answer never left it." That evening Miss Marple did something uncharacteristic. She went for a walk past the alehouse after dark. From the upstairs window no light flickered. The padlock remained, but beneath the boards something had shifted, like a long-closed wound starting to bleed. Miss Marple stood there for a moment longer. Somewhere someone was waiting, not to flee, but to be certain. Chapter 6. Confrontations and Secrets. The village of Darnley had reached the stage in its collective anxiety where silence grew louder than gossip. No one wanted to speak too boldly now, not after the whispers about the birth certificate had begun to spread in cautious, half-formed murmurs. Miss Marple had not said a word to anyone, but she could see the ripple already moving beneath the surface. The mere scent of scandal was enough to stir the silt of memory in a place like Darnley. And yet, if Miss Marple understood anything about human behavior, it was this. The first truth to surface was rarely the whole one. It was Tuesday afternoon, when Grace Hargreaves came to call. She arrived in a rush of breath and conviction, clutching her handbag like a weapon, and wearing an expression of someone long overdue for a reckoning. Miss Marple welcomed her with composed hospitality, set out a second cup of tea, and allowed Grace to find her own words. "He was his father, wasn't he?" Grace said at last. "Colin." Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. She poured the tea with great care, a quiet moment stretching between them like a bridge. "There's reason to believe so," she said gently. Grace nodded, her mouth tightening. "I always thought there was something strange about Thomas. Lydia said he'd been sent away to school in Devon, that it was better for him, what with Arthur being ... the way he was. But then he simply stopped existing. Not a word, not a visit. And when Arthur died, well, she never spoke of him again." "Did you ever meet the boy?" Grace hesitated. "Once, just once. He must have been 4 or 5. Pale little thing, but with Colin's eyes. Arthur was drunk that day, shouting about liars. I think he knew or suspected." Lydia was shaking. Miss Marple studied her. "Why come to me now, Grace?" "Because I think someone's trying to punish her," Grace said, her voice quivering. "And if you don't figure out who it is, they might succeed." Miss Marple gave the smallest of nods. That evening, a new event shifted the already unsettled waters. A stone was thrown through the front window of Lydia Hargreaves' cottage. It happened just after sundown, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the stillness. By the time Inspector Grayson arrived, the crowd had already gathered, tight-lipped neighbors muttering about a warning and righteous anger, though no one admitted to seeing the culprit. Lydia, for her part, stood inside the doorway, arms crossed, her lips thin with fury rather than fear. "Whoever it was," she said, her voice icily calm, "didn't do it for justice. They did it to shame me." Grayson remained calm. "There's been some discussion about the boy." Lydia met his gaze. "Of course there has. I expect the village will be digging through my flower beds next, looking for bones." "No one's accusing you of—" "They don't have to," she interrupted. "This place knows how to accuse with silence." Miss Marple, who stood beside Grayson with an air of quiet neutrality, finally stepped forward. "Lydia, dear," she said softly, "no one here wants to cause you further harm. But people are frightened, and where there is fear, suspicion grows." Lydia turned to her. "And what is it you suspect, Miss Marple?" "I suspect," said Miss Marple, "that someone else knew about Thomas before Colin returned. Someone who stood to lose something by his reappearance." Lydia's eyes flickered guilt or perhaps fear. It was hard to tell in the fading light. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. "The child was taken abroad," she said finally, "after Arthur died. I sent him to live with Colin's cousin in Barcelona. I knew I couldn't keep him here. Not after everything. Did anyone else know? No one. Not even Grace, not really. But someone found out, Miss Marple," murmured Dot. The next day, Miss Marple took a quiet stroll through the cemetery at the edge of the village. She often walked there in times of difficult thinking, believing, as she put it, that the dead had a way of simplifying the concerns of the living. There she encountered Hugh Penberry, the solicitor, standing before a grave near the far hedge. "Miss Marple," he greeted her with professional courtesy. "A rather grim time for contemplative walks." "Oh, I find graveyards oddly honest," she replied. "They remind us that secrets never truly stay buried." He offered a wan smile. "I suppose you've come across the rumors about Thomas." "I have," she said, watching his reaction. Hugh hesitated. "Colin came to see me last week. Wanted to discuss inheritance laws, quietly. Asked what it would mean if an heir came forward unexpectedly. Said it was hypothetical, of course, but it wasn't." "No, I don't believe it was." Miss Marple nodded. "Did you tell anyone?" "Of course not. Solicitor's code. But I suspect someone else overheard or deduced. Someone with a vested interest in the alehouse, perhaps." He looked startled. "The alehouse? But that's derelict. Worth very little." "Ah, but land in Darnley is always worth more than it seems, Mr. Penberry, especially when someone has plans for it." That evening the whispers became louder than ever. Colin Vole, it was said, had not simply come back for nostalgia. He had come back to claim something. A son, yes, but perhaps also the right to decide the future of the widow's alehouse. And if someone else had hoped to take possession of it through quiet transfer, inheritance, or simple abandonment, then Colin's reappearance had ruined everything. Miss Marple now saw the outline of motive begin to take shape. But motive alone was never enough. She sat by the fire and recalled something Ellie Townsend had said. He dropped his napkin. I bent to pick it up. Lydia placed the cup down, just for a moment. Just for a moment. A moment when anyone standing nearby could have touched the cup. And who had been standing nearby? Miss Marple reached for her notebook again, not to write names, but to draw a map. Not of the fate, but of positions. Of sight lines, of who could have seen what, and who could have acted unseen. The killer had not struck from rage or even fear. Had struck from timing. Chapter 7. Another twist by Thursday morning. A strange hush had taken hold of Darnley. The shops remained open, the post still arrived, and the bakery's bell rang as it always did, but something in the air felt taut, like a held breath. Miss Marple, whose habit it was to observe the undercurrents of village life, noticed that even the gossip had turned cautious. Not silenced, nothing ever silenced gossip in Darnley, but subdued. as though its usual participants were waiting for something to break. And break it did, though not in the way anyone expected. It was Ellie Townsend who discovered it. She had walked out just after dawn, her basket in hand, to gather hollyhock seeds from the border path near the churchyard. A peaceful ritual, part of her early morning calm. But as she passed the lane behind the widow's alehouse, she noticed something odd. The back door, long sealed, always bolted, was ajar. Not broken, not forced, just quietly open. Startled but drawn by something she couldn't quite name, she stepped closer. The door creaked as she nudged it, and a cool, musty scent drifted out. She did not go inside, but what she saw in the threshold was enough to send her running. An overturned chair, a broken teacup, and in the middle of the floor a single women's glove, black, with a small rip at the thumb seam. By the time Inspector Grayson arrived with 2 constables, a small crowd had gathered. The villagers stayed back, muttering, their breath misting. In the crisp morning air, Miss Marple arrived quietly, having heard from Ellie herself, who was pale and shaking but otherwise unhurt. It was the way the glove lay, Ellie kept saying, so perfectly placed, as though someone wanted it to be seen. Grayson, kneeling beside the broken cup, agreed. There was no sign of forced entry, he told Miss Marple under his breath, and the front doors still padlocked. Whoever came used the rear entrance, perhaps even had a key. Miss Marple bent and looked at the floor, not at the glove or the shards of porcelain, but at the dust. It had been disturbed, yes, but not entirely, just enough to imply a struggle, or a staged one. Something's wrong, she murmured. Grayson looked up. You think it's a message? I think it's a performance. She turned to him more fully. Who knew about the documents you found here? Grayson hesitated. Only a few. Myself. You. Penbury. Lydia. And, well, I suppose Grace Hargreaves might know. She's sharp. Perhaps 1 or 2 more by now. Word spreads. Indeed, Miss Marple said. And those documents threaten more than reputations. They threaten control. Later that day, Grayson summoned Lydia Hargreaves to the station for questioning, not as a suspect, but as someone who might offer context. She arrived composed, as always, in a deep green coat with her silver hair tied back. When shown the glove, she froze. It's mine, she said softly. I lost it months ago. I thought I'd dropped it outside the chapel. Do you recognize the teacup? Grayson asked. Lydia nodded, her voice barely audible. From the Fate. Part of my set. I donated them to the refreshment tent. Miss Marple watched closely. So someone brought it back here to the alehouse. Yes, Lydia said. Why? To draw attention to the room, Grayson replied, and perhaps to suggest your presence here. Lydia's mouth hardened. I haven't stepped foot in that building since the winter after Arthur died. Miss Marple broke in gently. You've said that before, Lydia, but I wonder, was that entirely true? Not out of guilt, but out of memory? Lydia looked away. It's not the place that haunts me, Miss Marple. It's what it contains. That night Miss Marple did not sleep well. Her thoughts turned not to Lydia, but to the child. Thomas Arthur Hargreaves, born in secret, raised in silence, and then disappeared into the folds of foreign family. Colin Vole had returned not merely to claim him, but to restore him. That much was clear now, but someone had decided the past should remain buried, and someone else, perhaps the same person, was now attempting to redirect suspicion, to muddle the lines and point the village's eye toward Lydia once more. That act, so carefully staged in the alehouse, reeked of manipulation. And yet it wasn't Lydia's ruin they were trying to secure. It was the truth. The following morning brought a subtle but crucial development. Hugh Penbury, the solicitor, visited Miss Marple of his own accord. He arrived hatless, which Miss Marple noted with quiet concern. "I've remembered something," he said as he sat, declining tea. "Colin asked me to look into something else. Something minor at the time, but perhaps not any more. Go on." He wanted to know if Lydia's ownership of the alehouse could be challenged if a new heir came forward. Specifically, if Thomas returned and was recognized legally. Miss Marple folded her hands. "And what did you tell him?" "That it could be complicated, but possible, especially if it could be proven that Arthur intended to pass the property to his son, even if the son wasn't publicly acknowledged." Colin seemed satisfied. "Said he'd be writing to someone in Spain." "Thomas? I assume so." Miss Marple's expression turned grave. "If Thomas was on his way here, then someone may have known that, too, and may have acted before he arrived." Penbury hesitated. "You think he's in danger?" "I think," she said slowly, "that if he arrives or has already arrived, he may be the final piece of a very dangerous puzzle." That afternoon a letter arrived at the post office. It was addressed to Lydia Hargreaves. The handwriting was unfamiliar, the stamp Spanish, but the signature at the bottom of the page carefully written. Just above the line read, "Thomas A. Hargreaves, Chapter 8, Miss Marple's Final Test." Letter was delivered just past noon on Friday, nestled inconspicuously among a clutch of bills and circulars. It was Miss Ivy Masters at the post office who first saw the name, Thomas A. Hargreaves, and went still for a moment, not from fear, but from the unspoken weight that hung over those particular syllables now. She said nothing, handed Lydia Hargreaves the bundle with a thin smile, and watched as the widow walked away down the lane. Lydia did not open the letter immediately. She waited until she was behind her garden gate, alone, her hands trembling only slightly as she slit the envelope with her thumb. Miss Marple, watching from across the street as she watered her roses, did not stare, but she did make a mental note of the exact moment Lydia paused halfway through the reading, pressed the letter against her chest, and let her shoulders collapse. Inward, she had seen the same posture once before on a young mother whose son had survived a mining collapse, only to lose both legs, relief and ruin. In the same breath, an hour later, Lydia Hargreaves arrived at Miss Marple's cottage. She did not speak for several seconds after being ushered in. Her coat was still buttoned, the letter folded neatly and held tightly in one hand. "He's alive," she said softly, sitting on the edge of the chintz armchair. "And coming. He says he never blamed me." "I'm very glad," Miss Marple said, setting aside her embroidery. "That will bring peace to you, I hope." Lydia nodded, but her eyes were elsewhere. "He doesn't know what's happened. I don't know how to tell him that Colin is gone, that this place still has claws." Miss Marple stirred her tea. "Then perhaps it's time we remove the claws altogether." Lydia glanced at her. "You know who did it, don't you?" "I believe I do," Miss Marple replied. But proof is a delicate thing in villages. It must be grown, not forced, and sometimes it must be invited. She rose and moved to the small table near the fireplace, where a modest, carefully arranged tea set waited, untouched. "I wonder, Lydia, if you might help me host a little tea gathering tomorrow afternoon. Just 3 guests. You, myself, and 2 people I believe know more than they've said." Lydia frowned. "Who?" "Greta Sims and Hugh Penbury." "Greta?" Lydia repeated, startled. Why would Miss Marple held up a hand? Because the right words, spoken in the right order in the right company, can do what no inquest ever could. Lydia hesitated. Then, quietly, she nodded. The next day, Miss Marple's parlor was set precisely as she preferred it, neat but warm, with sunlight falling in just enough to touch the rims of the teacups and glint across the polished sugar tongs. Greta Sims arrived first in a pressed blouse and tartan skirt, with a nervous smile and a plate of lemon biscuits that tasted slightly of soap. Hugh Penbury came next, all tight shoulders and clean fingernails, his brow furrowed and habitual. Thought. Lydia Hargreaves, serene but unreadable, arrived last. She took her seat across from Greta without a glance. Miss Marple poured the tea with gentle ceremony, asked after Greta's sister in Bournemouth, still unwell, and inquired whether Hugh had heard any word on the new planning application for the Westfield. He had not. Then, with the same serene tone, she placed her own cup down and said, "You'll all forgive me for being direct, but I do believe someone in this room has more to answer for than they realize." A silence fell. Taut as fishing line, Hugh shifted uncomfortably. "Miss Marple, if this is about Colin Vole—" "It is," she said. "And about his son, and about a cup of tea left momentarily unattended, and most especially about a teacup found in the widow's alehouse 2 days ago." Greta let out a small breath, as though catching herself before speaking. Miss Marple continued, her voice gentle. "You see, I've been thinking about the fate, how Lydia poured the tea, how Colin dropped his napkin, how Ellie Townsend picked it up, leaving the cup unattended for perhaps 10 seconds. She looked pointedly at Greta. "You were standing nearest, were you not?" Greta blinked. "Aye, yes, but I was helping with the raffle book. I hardly noticed." "Greta," Miss Marple said, leaning forward slightly, "you were seen handling the same set of teacups earlier that day. You fetched them from the vicarage storeroom. You packed them into a wicker basket. You knew exactly which ones came from Lydia's collection, including the one with the small crack in the base, the one later found in the alehouse." Greta's face paled. I didn't mean to kill him." Miss Marple's voice was cool now, but not cruel. "Or didn't mean for it to be traced back." Greta looked down at her lap. Her lips quivered. "He ruined everything," she whispered. Miss Marple said nothing. "I was going to buy the alehouse," Greta went on, her voice brittle. "I'd been speaking with Hugh for months about a plan, a shopfront, a seamstress co-op. I saved for years. Then Colin returned and started talking about inheritance, about family claims. Hugh said there was nothing we could do unless the child was dead or missing. But then I found a copy of that birth certificate in Colin's papers, while helping with the fate setup. He left his satchel unattended." She looked up suddenly. "I told Hugh. He said we'd sort it legally. But I knew what that meant. Years. Delays. and Thomas would return. Hugh rose to his feet. "Greta, I never told you to—" "No, you didn't," she snapped. "But you didn't stop me either." The room was very still. Miss Marple folded her hands. "And so you slipped something into his tea," she said. "You'd been to the chemist in Market Ledbury 2 weeks prior, purchased crushed digitalis under the pretext of helping a sick cat. Not entirely uncommon, though I dare say the cat never existed." Greta nodded, eyes glassy. "It was fast. He drank it and collapsed. I didn't mean for it to be so public. But then it happened, and I panicked." "So you staged the scene in the alehouse," Miss Marple finished, to turn suspicion back on Lydia. Greta broke then, fully. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing. "I only wanted a chance," she whispered. Miss Marple looked to Hugh. "And you? Did you truly know nothing?" "I suspected," he said quietly. "When I saw the cup I realized, but by then—" Miss Marple gave a slight shake of her head. "I think," she said, "that Inspector Grayson will want to hear all of this." An hour later, after the police had come and gone, Lydia sat across from Miss Marple in the quiet parlor, watching the last of the tea grow cold. "She would have let me hang," she said softly, "all for a seamstress shop." Miss Marple nodded. "Dreams can turn bitter, Lydia, especially in places where people aren't allowed to have many." Lydia looked toward the window. "Thomas arrives tomorrow. Then you'll have your peace at last." "I doubt that," she said with a faint smile. "But perhaps something better." Chapter 9. The reveal Saturday arrived with a stillness that seemed to press down over Darnley like a velvet curtain. The sun was shy behind a pale cloud cover, and the morning bird song, though present, felt hushed, as if even the robins sensed something important was about to happen. There were no more rumors, no more wild speculation in the bakery or sidelong glances in the chapel pews, because now the village knew, and what it knew was uncomfortable dote Greta Sims had been taken into custody quietly the evening before. She had not resisted, nor had Hugh Penbury, though his involvement, diluted by deniability, had earned him a more complicated fate. Not imprisonment, but scrutiny. Miss Marple, ever composed, had spoken at length with Inspector Grayson about the line between passive complicity and criminal intent. Hugh, it seemed, had managed to plant himself right on that uncomfortable border. But now, with the killer named and the truth rising to the surface, one more revelation awaited Dot. Miss Marple sat by her window that morning, knitting untouched in her lap, her shawl wrapped loosely around her shoulders. The tea had gone cold beside her, forgotten in her quiet anticipation. She had no plans to greet the train herself, not out of indifference, but deference. Some moments belong to the living. The young man stepped off the 10:17 from London with a suitcase in one hand and a folded letter in the other. He was tall, clean-shaven, with a modest posture and a gaze that searched rather than assumed. His coat was worn but tidy, his shoes polished, despite the dust of travel, and in his face, especially in the arch of his brows and the way he held his chin, was the unmistakable echo of a man who no longer walked the earth. Colin Vole. Thomas Arthur Hargreaves had arrived. Lydia was waiting at the edge of the platform, her hands tucked inside her gloves, her eyes unreadable. As he approached, there was no melodrama, no sudden cries or dramatic embraces. They looked at one another for a long moment. "You're taller than I imagined," Lydia said. "You're quieter than I hoped," Thomas replied, but there was a warmth beneath it. Then, quietly, they walked side by side out of the station and into the village. The return of Thomas was not the kind of event Darnley knew how to digest. There was no welcome banner, no murmured prayers in the chapel, just the occasional twitch of a curtain, the flicker of interest behind a shop window, a community bracing itself to rewrite the past. Lydia brought him to the small cottage behind the widow's alehouse, where she had prepared a modest supper and set the table as she once had when Colin used to visit, before Arthur, before the silence. They ate little. They spoke less. It was not until dusk that Thomas asked the question. "My father," he said gently. "How did he die?" Lydia hesitated. She had spent hours rehearsing this moment. How to shield him, how to soften the edges of cruelty. "He was poisoned," she said finally, "at the village fete. It was meant to look natural, but it wasn't." Thomas stared at the table for a long moment. "And you were blamed," he said softly. "Weren't you? I want you." Observed, watched. The village never says it aloud. It just waits for the worst to be proven. He nodded. "And who did it?" Lydia looked down at her hands. "A woman named Greta Sims. She feared losing something that hadn't even been hers yet. Your father's return threatened her ambitions." Thomas absorbed this in silence. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out a second letter. "He sent me this," he said, placing the envelope before her. "A week before he died, told me to wait, to be patient, that something important had to be set right first. I think he suspected." Lydia picked up the letter with trembling hands, but did not open it yet. Instead, she whispered, "He never stopped caring." "No," Thomas said. "I know he didn't." That night, as the village settled into the quiet rhythm of hearth and supper, Miss Marple received a visitor. It was Inspector Grayson. He removed his hat respectfully and stepped into the parlor with a sigh. "It's nearly closed now," he said. "Greta has confessed formally. Motive, opportunity, and means. Hugh's not off the hook, but legally it'll be more of a reprimand than anything else. He was clever enough to remain vague. The Crown may call it negligence, not collusion." Miss Marple nodded. "The law may not be perfect, but sometimes it balances itself in the long run." Grayson looked toward the fire. "And Thomas?" "Has returned to a village that never made space for him," she said, "and to a mother who once believed the only way to save him was to send him away. It will take time, but perhaps healing can begin now that the truth has come out." Grayson nodded. "And what about the alehouse?" "A mystery in itself," Miss Marple said with a soft smile. "But I believe Lydia will let it stay closed a little longer. The ghosts haven't finished their business yet." He chuckled lightly. "You always make it sound like the buildings themselves remember." "They do," she said simply. "Stone remembers where the heart forgets." When he left, Miss Marple returned to her chair. Her knitting lay still in her lap, untouched for days now. But her mind was calm. It had not been a murder of passion or revenge, as many had supposed. It had been a murder of desperation, small town. Fear of change, clashing with the inevitability of truth. Miss Marple had always known that truth seldom arrived loudly. It came in small pieces. A dropped napkin, a misplaced glove, a quiet tea shared with the wrong person. And now, with the pieces finally arranged, the picture was clear. Chapter 10. Aftermathy week passed, and the village of Darnley, ever resilient in its rituals, began to restore its surface calm. The cracked window of Lydia Hargreaves' cottage had been repaired. Greta Sinn's dressmaker's shop stood shuttered, its bolts rusting faster than usual in the late autumn damp. And at the widow's alehouse, ivy had begun its slow crawl back across the doorway, reclaiming the silence that now reigned within. But beneath the routines among the church flowers, the jam jars at the bakery, and the hush of the market lanes, Darnley remained changed. For the first time in years, the past had been unearthed, and for once it had been named aloud. Miss Marple sat in her garden, a shawl about her shoulders, and a small teacup balanced on the iron table beside her. She was not knitting. She was simply sitting watching the birds, the postman, the subtle shifts in the village's rhythm as the echoes of the crime faded but did not vanish. Lydia joined her in the late afternoon, dressed plainly in blue. The colors suited her less severe than her usual grays and greens. She walked with more steadiness now, as though some long-held tension had eased from her spine. "I wanted to thank you," Lydia said softly, "though I suspect you'll say it wasn't necessary." "I shall," Miss Marple smiled, "but you may say it all the same." Lydia sat beside her. "Thomas has decided to stay, for a while at least. He's curious and cautious, but kind. I see Colin in him." "He has your restraint," Miss Marple said. A pause followed, filled only by the soft rustle of wind through the hedges. "I think," Lydia said at last, "what frightens me now is not the past. It's the space it's left behind." Miss Marple gave a knowing nod. "That's always the way. When a secret is kept too long, it leaves a hollow. But hollows can be filled with truth if one is brave." Lydia looked toward the alehouse in the distance. "He asked me what I planned to do with it. I didn't know what to say." "You're allowed not to know. For the first time in many years, you're free to decide." Lydia stood after a moment and pressed a small envelope into Miss Marple's hand. "He left this for you, Colin. He'd written it before the fete. I found it among his things." Miss Marple waited until Lydia had gone before opening the envelope. The note inside was written in neat, slanted script. "Dear Miss Marple, if anything happens to me, something unnatural, I know you'll be the one to see it. You always did notice things others didn't. I came back to Darnley to write something, not to stir scandal, not even to claim what might be owed, only to acknowledge the truth. If you're reading this, I trust you've done what I no longer had time to do. For that, thank you. Not for me, but for Lydia, and for Thomas. Tell him I loved him, though I only ever did so in silence. C.V. Miss Marple folded the note slowly, placing it back in its envelope with reverent care. It was not the first time she had been entrusted with the final thoughts of the dead, and, as always, she felt the same quiet satisfaction that justice, however delayed, had not been entirely denied. The next day, the villagers gathered at St. Petronella's not for a funeral, but for a quiet dedication. Lydia had arranged it herself. The old wooden bench beneath the lime tree at the edge of the green had been cleaned, varnished, and fitted with a brass plaque in memory of Colin Vole, who returned, and in doing so restored. No speeches were made. No vicar sermonized. The villagers stood quietly, some bowing their heads, others simply taking in the sight of the name no longer whispered. But engraved Thomas stood beside Lydia, his hands tucked behind his back, his expression unreadable, but still. Miss Marple did not stand with them. She watched from her cottage window, as always, preferring the role of the invisible thread holding the pattern together. And in that small, sunlit moment, Darnley truly did return to peace. Not the peace of ignorance, the peace of truth. That evening, as dusk pooled once more over the village, Miss Marple took her seat by the fire. She picked up her knitting, resumed her stitches, and spoke aloud to no one in particular. Funny thing, human nature. It may tangle itself in lies for years, but given the faintest light, it always casts the truest shadow. She smiled, and with that she returned to her pattern, each loop neat and precise, as though the world itself might be mended, stitch by careful stitch.